a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today online. Thank you so much for being here with us. So my name is Sarah, and I am the program manager here for the PhD program in the EI. We also have Jonathan White with us today, who is the program director here, and we also have three students or alumni joining us today as well, who we'll get to hear from them, and also have a Q&A session. So just quickly, our agenda for the day. So I'm going to pass it off to Jonathan White, who will discuss the program in detail for the first 10 to 15 minutes, and then I will pass it over to our students and alumni to share their stories of being here at the EI and at LSE. And then the last half will be a Q&A session with all of us, so with Jonathan, with the students, alumni, and myself. So I'm going to go ahead. Okay, good. We have the poll ended. So I'm going to pass it off over to you, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. I hope everyone can hear me well. So my name is Jonathan White. And I am Professor of Politics at the Open Institute, and I'm also the Program Director for the PhD program, and that's the capacity in which I'll say a few words now. So I've been at the LSE for some time now, since 2008. So seen a lot of PhDs, seen a lot of years of the PhD program. And if you have questions, then also later on I'll be able to try and take some of those. But first of all, just to frame our thoughts, let me say a few things. I guess anyone who's interested in doing a PhD is going to be thinking on the one hand about that very point, whether they want to do a PhD, and secondly, where they want to do a PhD. I think those are the major considerations for anyone who is in this session, because they feel that maybe this could be an option for them. And I guess I'll speak to both of those themes a little bit, but firstly, about the Open Institute at LSE. So it's been around now for, I guess, something like 35 years. It's one of the smaller departments of the LSE, and in some ways one of the more distinctive, insofar as it's got quite a spread of research themes. So we study matters European in quite an encompassing sense. Initially, when the Institute was founded back in the early 90s, that often meant something to do with transitions to Europe in the post-communist world. So some notion of countries that had been somehow excluded by history from the European story, as it was sometimes narrated in that period, and that were now getting the opportunity to return to the fold. Well, the Open Institute and, of course, the world around it has moved on some distance since then. But broadly, this orientation to thinking about questions of Europe and of the boundaries of Europe and Europe in the world, as opposed to simply intra-European phenomena, is very much the heart of its focus. As you can see on this slide here, there's a number of different research themes that people study at the European Institute. This applies to staff, it applies to PhD students, somewhat also corresponds to our MSc programs. So you can see here politics and policy, political economy, culture and society, and migration. These are fairly, as I say, elastic categories. So I think if you have some interest in something broadly to do with Europe, you're probably going to find that one of these speaks to that, and you shouldn't, I think, feel put off if your particular idea for what you might work on doesn't seem to fit all too neatly under those categories. We're fairly accommodating about the things that we feel belong under those, but that is roughly the spread of our disciplines, and it means that anyone that comes to the European Institute is going to be surrounded by other researchers at PhD level, postdoc level, staff level, who are broadly working on this range of issues. And this, I guess, is characteristic of the European Institute experience. In other words, whereas some departments at LSE are clearly quite disciplinary, and focus on sociology, let's say, it itself, of course, permits very many different interpretations, but consciously understood as having a certain kind of disciplinary orientation. That's not the European Institute. Instead, we are interested in a range of different themes, a range of different methodologies and a range of different disciplines. And anyone who comes here ends up then being surrounded by people working on quite a range of stuff. I think this is one of the unique and attractive features of the European Institute. But of course, it doesn't really come at the expense of having access to those who are more closely interested in the same types of research as you, because of course the European Institute as a department within the LSE gives you all the access to colleagues in other departments, to PhD researchers who are working, maybe in sociology, in government, in international relations, and a whole range of other departments where you might find plenty of people who are quite adjacent to what your research interests end up being. So that's the European Institute in a very general sense. It's kind of an interdisciplinary, multi-methodological department, a department like others in terms of its status at LSE, but in some ways distinctive because of this spread of topics. And as I say, what you don't then miss out on is everything else that LSE has to offer. Let me say perhaps a little bit more about the PhD program and how it looks in terms of its structure. So people who are at the European Institute, well, this slide seems to be a slide about the diversity of backgrounds to which people come to the European Institute from, which I think is certainly been my experience in the 17 years or whatever I've been at LSE, and that hasn't really changed, I should add, since Brexit, since the very major changes in Britain's relationship to the European Union that have happened in the last decade. I would say the European Institute in that respect has maintained its heavily internationally diverse background, with a lot of people coming from other parts of Europe to study here, but also much further afield as well. Let's go back then to that slide about how the PhD program looks in the European Institute. So it's a 4-year program where typically the first year is where people are sort of finding their feet, consolidating their project ideas, working out exactly how they want to proceed, sometimes taking more specialist courses that may help them with the method side of their research, but also taking part in the European Institute's own particular methods course called EU 550 and learning in tandem with others who are joining at the same time about some of the core methods that they may want to be using in their PhD. But the first year, has this quality of, I guess, offering any further training and any further exposure to brainstorming, contact with other academics that maybe, in addition to supervisors, might be able to steer early decisions in the project. That's very much what the first year of a PhD would look like. And then continues, as I say, for 3 more years beyond that. So a 4-year program in total, which ultimately then culminates in a viva where people defend the thesis that they've been preparing. In terms of the entry requirements, people come to the European Institute with typically strong academic backgrounds. I think, like all LSE departments, this is a competitive entry for PhD places. And that will typically mean concretely at least a merit in a taught master's degree. Often many people will come with distinctions, but of course people come from different backgrounds, so the terminology may be slightly different in different cases. But this is roughly the preconditions in terms of past academic achievements. And then when people do get a place, and I'll say more about how we allocate places, but when people do get a place, then it is typically fully funded either by a scholarship that comes from the LSE itself or by a scholarship that comes from one of the funding bodies that help to support PhDs in Britain. You can see the ESRC is one of those listed here. Also, the AHRC has a particular track that does apply to the European Institute, though many of our researchers would be with the ESRC or with the LSE studentship. There are other opportunities that may be available, but typically those are the main reference points, and we aim to make sure that people who are doing a PhD with us do have funding through one of these channels so that they are not having to seek other sources of funding. You can see there's a deadline listed on this slide, and that's in mid-January, on the 14th of January. It's relatively soon, but again, it's 2 months away, so there's plenty that can be done between now and then in terms of thinking further about whether you want to proceed, making potentially contacts with potential supervisors, and also, of course, preparing the project outline. And I'll say a little bit more about all those in just a second. But in terms of the timing, we're looking at an application deadline of mid-January. This is mainly determined by the deadlines associated with the funding. As I say, that we like people to come with funding to the European Institute, and to be part of that program of being considered for funding, these are the relevant deadlines. There are later application deadlines one can also apply to, but I would strongly recommend that people consider the January deadline as the definitive one, because this is when most applications come in, and when the early decisions, at least about offers, are being made. Sarah, could we perhaps go on to the next slide, which will no doubt surprise me with the contents. There we go. Okay, program content, key milestones, and supervision. So the first one, as I said, it's a reference to some of the structures that make a PhD program at the European Institute distinct. In other words, although we're relatively small as a department, we have our own structures. We have a PhD seminar where all our PhD students in the first years of their PhD come together, make presentations, discuss each other's work, offer feedback, also get feedback from staff. This is a weekly seminar, so this is quite a core part of the structure of what it is to be a PhD student at the European Institute. And then in addition to this, as I say, LSE itself offers many options for additional training, for taking substantive courses, perhaps on a topic that you're hoping to work on and you want to learn a bit more about the relevant scholarship on that. You have access to master's programs as they're being taken by master's students all around you at the LSE. And I think, importantly, you have access to those without having necessarily to do the examination, the assessment processes that come with that. In other words, you're free to audit, as it's called, these courses, so that you can learn from them, interact with the students and the staff, basically do the course in full, but without having to be ultimately assessed at the end of it. So that's some of the kind of the wider resources available. The Methodology Institute at the LSE has a lot of courses that may be particularly relevant in that respect, insofar as they teach you about particular types of research, whether it's quantitative research, qualitative research, interviewing, focus groups, all these kind of different things that might form the backbone of a PhD itself. As I said, it's a 4-year program. Different years have different complexions. The 4th year, the final year, of course, is very much the business end of the program, and people are focusing mainly on finalizing the text that they are writing to defend in their viva. The early year, as I said, the first year is very much about settling, about getting better to grips with what you want to write about, getting better resourced in terms of the methods you are aware of, the people that you could work with, and also just making contacts with your fellow students. And in between that, the second and the third year, I guess, is where the heart of research on a PhD is done. There are some moments where you are assessed. In other words, it's not entirely up to you and your supervisors, but there is relative freedom in the second and third year, apart from at the end of the third year, an assessment where you are asked to make a presentation to other members of the department, including other PhD researchers and a nominated assessor, and you get feedback on how things are looking as you go into the final year of the PhD. Of course, then the final element of structure associated with the PhD program is, of course, the supervision. At the European Institute, we typically have 2 supervisors for every PhD researcher, both of whom are likely to have some degree of expertise in the research that the individual is writing upon. And of course, this is often one of the decisive considerations in whether one actually joins the PhD program, whether there's a good fit between what an individual wants to work on for their PhD and what the staff in that department are able to supervise and are keen to supervise. So that is a key element of the selection, but it's then a key element of when someone is actually here is their work with their supervisors, which is going to be kind of regular meetings, especially in the first year and the second year, but always multiple meetings per term, allowing the individual to, well, to present written work and to get feedback from their supervisor about how it's all going, and of course to get mentorship about generally what steps to make if one wants to go deeper into an academic career or to another career after the PhD. Those supervisors, I guess at least one of them is likely to become a manifest in the course of the application process and the interviews. I'll say more about that in a moment. So it's most unlikely that you would come to LSE and have no sense of who the supervisor would be, and indeed supervisors plural. But the second one is sometimes something you can revisit over the course of the first year, or maybe hasn't been allocated yet, but you would always come to LSE with at least one supervisor clearly identified. Let's perhaps talk a little bit more about things that come towards the end of the program. In other words, for many people, doing a PhD is perhaps something they're drawn to because they want to go into academia. As you can see there in the list of universities, quite a few of our PhD students have gone on to prestigious universities after the LSE, including also the LSE, to do postdocs, to take jobs, and yeah, I mean, scattered all around the international universities of the world, you'll probably find some people, certainly from LSE, but also from the European Institute. And as a way of facilitating this, as I say, this is partly something that supervisors can give assistance with, thinking about where might be a suitable place to apply to for postdocs, for thinking about how to publish work from one's PhD, which I think is often very important for looking for a position afterwards. So all that process of kind of guidance through not just the PhD, but the early steps of an academic career is something that you would expect from your supervision at the European Institute. But of course, people don't just go on to academia, European Institute, partly because we have this kind of strongly interdisciplinary aspect to us. I think it also means that we also send out people into other types of activity, non-academic. We have an events program at the LSE, which is very strong and brings a lot of policy-oriented people to the European Institute. And that's why I guess a fair number of our PhD students would also go on to that kind of activity after their PhD, maybe in the public sector. And you can see there's a lot of national civil services and European civil services that we feed people into, have done over the years, but also in the private sector as well. So there's a lot of, I guess, destinations. I think some of this is also listed on our website, and you can, of course, make contact if you want to with past PhD students on any of these kind of points, including those who are currently in the room. But yeah, you'll see that the European Institute, while many people would go on to academia afterwards, that's certainly not the only trajectory from which people leave the European Institute. A large portion of people go on to non-academic work afterwards. And again, we aim to assist and support people in that direction as well. Sarah, perhaps you can give me a little reminder of what I still have ahead of me. How to apply this, of course, is perhaps what many people have joined the session to hear a little bit more about. You've heard this idea of a deadline on the 14th of January, but a deadline for what? Well, basically for uploading a number of important materials to the online system. It's all done, of course, electronically. And some of those documents are, of course, fairly standard parts of your existing record. So a CV, transcripts of previous university qualifications, language test results, and so on. I guess that's all fairly self-explanatory. Then perhaps most importantly, well, no less importantly, would be what you exactly want to study for a PhD. In other words, if the other things are thresholds, getting across a certain threshold in terms of the strength of your CV, then very much what determines amongst a group of strong applicants who ultimately is going to proceed to join the European Institute would be the statement, the proposal they write about why they want to do a PhD, and most importantly, what kind of PhD they would like to write. In other words, what kind of topic, what kind of research question, how you would intend to go about addressing that. I think it's fairly characteristic of PhDs, certainly in Britain, that people start them with a relatively developed sense of what it is they want to work on. Programs in North America, for example, I think there's often the sense that you join possibly with very little sense of where you want to head in terms of the substance of your PhD, and that's very much the theme of the first year of work. At the LSE and Britain in general, I would say the expectation is that you do have some sense of what it is that you'd like to work on, that you've put some thought into that, into writing a research proposal. In other words, a kind of a short, coherent outline of the project that you would hope to execute as part of your PhD. And this then becomes quite important for the selection process, partly because it may be an indicator of the strengths of your application generally, but also because it indicates the fit between your application and the capacity of staff at the European Institute to supervise it. So I would certainly, if you do intend applying this year, or indeed any year, but this year with the deadline being in 2 months, I would certainly center a lot of your preparations on exactly the development of a research proposal which is internally coherent and plausibly connects to the research interests of people at the European Institute. In other words, have a look at staff, at the webpage that gives an indication of everything that we study and the individuals who study different topics, and be aware of that when you write your research proposal, who it is potentially that could supervise it. Some people write an email to a potential supervisor to make contact and to see whether that person would be interested in the topics they have in mind. That's really not a precondition. It's often the case that people simply make the application through the system. Then we have fairly developed processes for distributing proposals amongst staff that might be suitable supervisors. So it all gets taken care of through the process itself if you prefer to do it that way. As I say, other people may like sometimes to make contact with potential supervisors and see if they are taking on students this year, if they would be interested in a certain type of proposal, and so on. That's something that different people do differently. But ultimately, once you've submitted into the system, we have a fairly organized process of making sure that every potential supervisor gets the chance to consider the proposal, to read it, to get a feel for the individual, and if they would like to be part of an interview, which I think is probably the next slide. It's the next part of the application process. So we shortlist those who look like particularly strong applicants to the program to interview them online on a Zoom call, a bit like this, but with fewer people involved. Typically 2 or 3 members of staff, as well as the individual applicant. And we have a fairly in-depth discussion of the research proposal, of the candidate's motivation for doing a PhD, and basically it's an opportunity for potential supervisors and me as the program director to get a better feel for the application, for the strengths, for the things that would need to be worked further on, and again for potential supervisor or supervisors to decide who they would most likely work with in the coming years. So this is something that you would hear about, I guess, a few weeks after the January deadline, probably late January, early February, something all the way through to February itself. I think something in that time span would be when you could expect, if you were going to be invited to interview to hear from us. And then this feeds into a large kind of committee discussion that's had amongst colleagues at the European Institute later on to rank the applications and to decide who we will offer places to and in what order. I think it's fair to say that most places we offer are accepted, but that's not universally true. Sometimes people are offered a place and ultimately decline it, and therefore people who are on a waiting list would later on be offered a place as well. So that means that the process, although it becomes increasingly kind of clear from March, April onwards, sometimes places might even be offered a couple of months after that, very much depending on the take-up. But generally, this is the shape of things. A January deadline, a process of interviewing that runs through February and into March, and then decisions that issue from that in the spring. Okay. Is there anything that I still need to talk about, Sarah, or have
You
I?
are all good. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for sharing. So we're going to move on to our students and alumni session. So I'd like to introduce Nilofer, Paul, and Jakob. So Nilofer, she's a third-year student with us. Paul is actually having his Viva in 2 weeks, and Jakob is an EI alumni and is now an LSE fellow with us here in the EI. So I'm going to hand it over to you all. I'm going to stop sharing so we can actually see you all. And if you could just all speak about your time here at the EEI for about 5 minutes or so, that would be great. And then we can go into the Q&A session. So Nilofer, I'll go ahead and start with you if you're okay with that.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I guess I'll start briefly by introducing myself and my research. I'm Nilofer. I'm a third-year PhD student, so in my penultimate year of the PhD. And I work broadly on reformist mineral powers and their resistance towards the international liberal order. And I focus specifically on Turkey and Turkish foreign policy. And maybe more specifically, if anyone's interested, I look at 3 cases or 3 instances like humanitarian aid, conflict mediation, or coalition building in sort of understanding that resistance. And I mostly have a qualitative research where I do qualitative content analysis. So I'm on the more qualitative side of the research. So yeah, I joined the EI, I guess, a little bit over 2 years ago. And I was really interested in the European Institute in particular because obviously, given the topic of my research and that the EI hosts the Contemporary Turkish Studies as a research group, as this academic community, I found it really interesting that I could find an academic network that I could sort of have on the side, where in a place where I'm kind of doing similar research and to interact with this academic network, which is in itself interdisciplinary as well as the European Institute. I also found this Beyond Eurocentrism program quite interesting because my research relates very specifically to Eurocentrism and sort of challenging Eurocentrism in international relations. So the fact that the EI was also part of this Beyond Eurocentrism program, that it was leading this approach towards critical studies, was also quite interesting for me. And I guess also having a supervisor that was quite similar to that worked on similar aspects to me, I think also kind of drew me to the European Institute. Should I share a bit more about my experience so far, perhaps? Yeah. I mean, I've had a quite positive experience so far. I think different aspects like EU 550, which Jonathan spoke about, have been really helpful in me developing my research in my first year, and then kind of getting feedback along the way in my second year and now my third year has been very helpful for me. There's lots of opportunities within EI, but also outside of it, a lot of IR seminars that you can join as PhD students and build academic network, also expand your research, having input through different ways. I've found a pretty positive aspect of the PhD experience, and just the community within EI itself. I've had a very positive experience with. I think everyone's quite interested in learning about each other's researches, and just a very supportive community within the department. So yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that, but I can come back to anything or any aspects during the questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Paul. Can I pass it over to you?
Yeah, sure. Hey everyone, I'm traveling, so sorry for any background noise. I'm Paul. As Sarah mentioned, I recently submitted my PhD, the Viva, in 3 weeks, not 2, so I have a bit more time. But about to hopefully defend the thesis. I very recently started a postdoc at the University of Southampton, following the submission of the PhD. A 3-year project on a 3-year position on an ERC project. So if people are maybe not at that stage, but in general, if people are interested in talking about the academic job market, postdoc applications, that kind of stuff, I might have some thoughts to share. I was supervised by Jonathan, and I guess I broadly work on how people themselves make sense of politics and how they orient themselves towards European politics. I did a lot of qualitative field work, now trying to lean also a bit more into mixed methods. The European Institute, I guess I would want to emphasize maybe 2 things. One that Jonathan already touched upon regarding this aspect of access. I think the European Institute is in a very good and interesting position to have access to really many parts of the school. I, for example, fairly early on made contacts in the government department, was joining seminars at the government department, made a lot of friends, peers at the government department. And I think because we are so multidisciplinary, really get the chance to have not multiple affiliations, but to have substantive relations to other departments, and you're kind of not missing out on what's going on there, which is something I think one shouldn't underestimate. And that might relate to another point on the kind of profile that you have when you join the European Institute as a PhD, because I guess we talked about it recently, that there's certain questions before applying about what it means to have a PhD in European studies and whether this label in a way really means much. And I think you shouldn't worry about that at all in a way, because after all, you will have a PhD from the LSE, from the European Institute, but really in a discipline that you will have defined over the course of the PhD program. So it's not, I think, that there's any disadvantage in having a PhD in European studies regarding your disciplinary fit. Yeah, I guess maybe other points we can leave for a Q&A. So maybe Jacob.
All right. Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob. I was also a PhD at the EI. I'm still at the EI, but now in a postdoc role as an LSE fellow. So I finished the PhD last year, defended in the summer. I would say I'm a political sociologist. So, I mean, I worked a lot on citizenship and secularism and the public role of religion in Europe. And I became really interested in Christianity, I suppose, and how Christianity influences normative ideas of what it means to be a good citizen. So this is something that I really came across during my field work. I didn't quite set out into the PhD thinking that I would be writing about this. So for me, that was one of the nice things also of the EI PhD, because it's slightly longer than some other PhD programs that you may come across. So for me, having this 4th year was great because it was an ethnographic project. So I spent a lot of time in the field, talking to people, shadowing people, doing participant observation. So it's a very qualitative piece of work. I mean, the overall research project, I don't know. I mean, for me, it came out of my master's thesis. It was, I mean, I'm saying this because I imagine that some of you are also at this point where you've kind of finished this master's and you're not quite sure what is my project maybe? What is it that I might want to pursue in the PhD? I mean, for me, it was helpful to think about what is it that I wrote about in my master's thesis, for example, and what is, if I had to come up with one book that I wish existed, but it doesn't exist, and that I would like to write, right? Whether I'll be able to write it or not is a separate question, but that I think this is the thing that I would like to see. That's kind of a nice idea, I think, to go into a PhD. I think that's like a little bit the scope of what maybe you should be aiming for. So that's how I arrived at my project. And then as Jonathan said, I really for me, choosing BI was also a matter of the supervisor. So I really contacted people before, which was a good strategy for me. So that worked very well for me. I had a lovely time during the PhD. As other people have said, in the first year, I did find it useful to have EU 550 as a kind of first way of getting feedback in a community of peers. But then, as Paul said, I think over time, for me, what I enjoyed was also trying to build my own network of people who have shared interests, who may have been from other departments at the LSE, or even from beyond. And this is something that really the department has also facilitated. Like, for example, we are together with a couple of colleagues, we are running a conference for early career researchers, which we can invite to the LSE. So we can come up with our own topics. The department is really supporting that in terms of logistics, in terms of financial support also, if people maybe come from institutions with slightly less money, so they can still travel to London and join us. So there are lots of these kinds of opportunities. So I think as many people have said, DEI is an interdisciplinary department, which is broadly speaking a blessing, I think, right? Because you are exposed to different people who do different things. And I think that is, at the end of the day, is an advantage because it forces you to also maybe explain your research in ways that you wouldn't have to if you only ever hang out with all the same people. But sometimes it also means that it's great to go out and to find people who work more narrowly on something that you are interested in. And the good thing is that the department, as I was trying to say, kind of supports both of these prongs, right? Of you trying to build an intellectual community. Maybe I'll just stop there and I'll see what questions there are. I'm happy to talk, like Paul, also a bit about the end of the PhD, the postdoc experience, anything throughout. I'm looking forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for joining today and talking about your experience. So I'm going to open this up for the Q&A session. So I know we have some questions already. So I'm going to go ahead and read some of these out, and then Jonathan, Nilofer, Jacob, Paul, if you guys would like to answer these, please do. So the first is it common to only write one published paper, or are there PhD students who write multiple published papers?
Well, I think more the latter. In other words, I guess it's partly a question of when you're referring to exactly, but writing a PhD is often a process of writing material that will be published ultimately. Sometimes, and perhaps conventionally, that was heading towards a book publication, and many of our current PhD students might still be writing a large monograph that would end up as a book. But even those who are writing that, a monograph, will be probably writing published papers for publication in journal articles as they do this. I think especially towards the end of the third year into the fourth year, this is when people will especially start to turn their attention to this. Those who are writing a PhD in the format of 3 papers, it's clearly a logical extension then to start sending those out for possible publication. And I think in today's academic situation, it would often be papers plural rather than just the one paper in answer to the question. So yeah, we try and steer our researchers to thinking about these questions, to suggesting what might work well as a standalone paper. how the process actually works of applying for things. Where does one apply? What kind of journals would be suitable for what kind of research? With the idea being that, especially those that want to go into academia afterwards, do need to have a number of strong publications on their CV in order to be competitive.
Thank you for that. Hopefully that answers your question there. Another question for you, Jonathan. Someone asked, what are the links between the European Studies Department and a law school when it comes to European law?
I think most of the experts in European law at the moment are in the law school. In other words, there are quite a few people that work on EU law there. We have historically had colleagues working on EU law within European Institute. We certainly have political scientists of European law and regulation, but I think many of the current experts, if you want to work on EU law in its detail, then it may be that the law school would be the place to prioritize. But in terms of links, I mean, I've, for example, co-supervised one of our PhD researchers a few years ago with someone who was in the law department, who was the researcher was working on, I guess you could call it a political theory of the European Central Bank. And I was one supervisor, and the co-supervisor was Mike Wilkinson, who is a scholar of EU law and a kind of constitutional theorist as well in the law department. So there are established links at the level of patterns of co-supervision. There are also seminars that run with the government and the law department. I know some of our PhD students involve themselves in those activities. But for someone that's really wanting to do a very focused piece on EU law, then probably have a look at the staff list for the law school as the first point, because I think that's probably where the real expertise of the LSE on that question lies at the moment.
Perfect. Thank you. So I've had a couple questions about funding. So we already answered one of them, but most of our PhD students are either an LSE studentship, which is attainable for about 4 years and cover full fees and an annual stipend. But Jonathan, do you kind of want to talk more about how funding is allocated?
Yeah, so as we narrow down through the interview process, the applications to those that we would really like to make places to, we at the same time, and this gets discussed by committees, we think about where the funding could come from for each case. So in some cases, something like the ESRC, which is a funding agency, it has calls with particular methodological orientations in mind. So I think they had something last year for someone that was working on data science, and it turned out that one of our applicants was proposing something that could plausibly be fitted under that rubric, and indeed he did indeed get the ESRC scholarship accordingly. So we look out for possible complementarities between the research project and any particular specifications that an agency like the ESRC is highlighting. As I say, we also have the LSE studentships to allocate. So it's through a process of thinking about which projects might fit best with these. In many cases, there's no particular kind of correspondence between them. In other words, it could be just as well the LSE one or the ESRC one. But in terms of any specifications that come with the fellowships, we try and take account of that as we're thinking about who could go where. But in terms of the application process, it's really something that we try to keep in-house. It's not really about the individual making applications. It's about us steering applications to places that are made available to us for funding. So it's something that you don't really have to worry about as an individual. It's something that the department works on.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hopefully that answers people's questions. I have a couple for the students. Jonathan, you can also comment on this one. But my question is related to a research proposal. Does the research topic have to be related to Europe/European studies? And is there any possibility to extend it beyond Europe?
So we're pretty inclusive in what we mean by Europe. So people do empirical projects, for example, that maybe have a comparative element that takes in other parts of the world. We have people that do theoretical projects that perhaps have some kind of connection to the history of European ideas, but maybe no particular empirical reference point in terms of where one is looking in the world for the kind of expression of those ideas. To that extent, again, it's somehow inflected by Europe, but in a very encompassing fashion to take in the history of ideas, political theory, and so on. So, in answer to the question, yes, there does need to be some kind of link to Europe because it's the European Institute, but it's a broad link that can only sometimes be sort of geographically construed. It can also be intellectually construed. It can be comparative and so on. And of course, part of what some people want to work on is exactly the question of, well, what counts as something European to be studied under the heading of European studies? Could it be that sometimes things that we think of as not part of European studies actually should be considered in these terms? Are there ways in which certain topics, certain themes have been neglected from the study of Europe? So the boundary question is part of your question, I think, is also what some people choose to exactly work upon and to kind of challenge where those boundaries lie. But the short answer would be yes, there has to be some nominal connection to Europe. This is the European Institute, but that is something that I think is fairly broadly interpreted, and a lot of projects with the right type of framing and justification might duly find their place under that heading. I don't know if any of our researchers want to speak to that question too.
I mean, I guess I could come in to share because I think my research doesn't very neatly categorize under European studies, but it does when we take into account this like more encompassing idea of Europe. And I have a more comparative research that, for example, explores ideas of how Turkey positions itself in reference to Europe in different circumstances. So even if it's not neatly European focused, it does come to study Europe in different manners. So of course, this is the European Institute, and there needs to be a link to it, but that link, as you kind of said, specifically in my research, is not focused directly, but more in tangents.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Nilofer. And thanks, Jonathan, as well. I'm going to move on to a question from Luca. He says, what's the balance between qualitative and quantitative methods applied by scholars at the EI? Would proposing a research through qualitative methods find more faculty members ready to supervise it than a quantitative one?
My own impression, and anyone else can speak to the same point, is that we divide fairly evenly between the two kinds of project. Of course, under both headings, you can do many different kinds of projects. But we have people that do quantitative research. I mentioned someone that took the ERC place last year with a project which I think is very much quantitative and build on big data methods. We have at the same time plenty of supervisorial capacity in the full gamut of quantitative methods. And of course, some people may choose to do a bit of both as well. So mixing of methods is another possibility. I don't think it's possible to say that there's a kind of an accent in one direction more than the other. We have obviously political economists, but we don't necessarily understand by political economy the quantitative study of the economic world. Indeed, many of our political economists exactly apply qualitative methods to thinking about economic questions. So to that extent, I don't think one can easily do the calculations based on the spread of research topics and say this is a more quantitative end of the department, this is a more qualitative end. I'd say it's generally a bit of both in every cohort. Was that the experience of our researchers? I mean, do qualify what I'm saying if you see it differently.
I guess there can be, because the program is relatively small, also when you compare it to other departments, there can be maybe sometimes the impression that it's dominated by certain methods. But I would also say that if one were to look, I don't know, through all the cohorts and generations, it definitely varies quite a bit. So I would underline what Jonathan said. One addendum one might have is that I do think that these are genuine questions that will come up also for individual projects in what I did perceive it as a sort of healthily, or is that a term, in a good challenging way, that if you encounter people who work primarily with certain methods and who on that basis maybe challenge certain propositions that you make on the basis of their validity or their ability to support certain ideas, I think that's quite helpful and another strength of the multidisciplinarity of the department. But that also only, I think, speaks to the presence, let's say, of both methods.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, guys. Okay, I'll move on to the next question. I do realize that we only have a couple minutes left. So Joel asked, did you mainly work on your own project, or were there opportunities to co-publish through extra projects with other people? How was the experience connecting with think tanks or other institutes you could potentially work for after finishing the PhD?
Who wants to speak to this? Maybe I'll just say impressions again, and then we can get some further impressions. I think while working on your own project is clearly the core, I think plenty of our PhD researchers do maybe co-author a paper, often with another researcher, for example. Maybe it turns out that someone in their cohort or in another part of LSE is working on something related. And then you quite often get someone who therefore co-writes a paper, takes it to a conference, ends up publishing it with joint authorship. So, and then in terms of with a supervisor, I think that's probably slightly less common. I think our general feeling is that co-authored papers with supervisors tend to be much less valuable to a researcher in terms of their CV than anything that they either single author or they co-author with other people of their peer group in terms of showing what you're able to publish and showing your ideas and so on. So although I think it does happen that sometimes people write something with their supervisor, and certainly happens after their PhD, for example, probably the main focus is going to be on writing your own project and the occasional co-authorship with a peer, because these are the ways that you really establish your credentials if you want to go into the job market later on.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe I can just come in. I just to kind of back up a little bit what Jonathan was saying. I also think what I wouldn't discount is the opportunity you have to focus on your own project, which I mean, I think is a gift that one doesn't always have, right? I mean, when do you have time to spend 4 years on something that you want to pursue? So especially in the early years, in the first year, for example, I mean, I really loved having the time to read a lot of stuff that otherwise I would not have had the opportunity to read. And I still think it made also my project better, right? So I think the PhD program does give you that space to really sit with the project and with an idea, which I think is something that is rare to find in, maybe even in academia after, but also, I mean, in general, in any kind of professional context, right? Where you have many more competing obligations that somehow come your way. So I think for me, this was, maybe I'm a bit romantic, but like for me, this was one of the nice things about the PhD.
Okay, thank you guys for sharing. So I do realize we have about 1 minute left, so I'm going to move on to one last question. But what I'd like to say before everyone leaves, if you do have further questions, or if we weren't able to get to your questions, I do realize there were some really good ones out there. Please do email us. Final question would like to ask, let me move up here. Sorry, trying to find.
I guess maybe the question about how much a proposal evolves over the course of the PhD is quite an important one, and maybe I should have said something earlier on about it. I mean, I think it's often the case that it evolves quite significantly. So it's an application process that requires you to state your intentions and to make a proposal of research. And of course, many projects grow directly out of that proposal, and 4 years later, there's something in common with the proposal initially made. But at the same time, it evolves a lot. Of course, that's partly the rationale for supervision. If it didn't evolve, then ultimately, what is one getting from the supervision? Also, people, of course, change their interests or their ideas, their focus. So I think over the first year, especially, it can change quite a lot, and then starts to settle down in the years following. Nonetheless, as I say, we ask for a proposal to be made, and that's to ensure that there's some kind of congruence with the supervisorial expertise we have. So I don't think one should apply as though the proposal was entirely provisional and had no real kind of significance for anything that one does when one comes. Yes, it should be understood as the basis on which the PhD emerges, but that nonetheless entails a lot of revision, change, new angles emerging that initially weren't so clear. And of course, as Jacob mentioned a moment ago, that can be something that happens in line with the research itself. In other words, in his project, the increasing focus on the place of Christianity and thinking about citizenship and citizenship education, that's something that was very much an encounter with the field work. So things change, whether it's because the individual and their ideas change, whether the supervision encouraged certain changes to be made, or whether the research itself leads things in a slightly unexpected direction, as it often will do. But nonetheless, we expect a proposal as part of the application. So there is some expectation that you can kind of think of something that at least plausibly is the project of the next 4 years at the moment of application.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I do realize we're out of time, but I'm going to share our screen with our email. So if you do have any questions at all, please do email us. Let me get this pulled up. But just like to say thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, Nilofer, Jacob, Paul, for joining us today. That was really great, your answers. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We're really excited that you're here, and hopefully we will be seeing you very soon. So you can see here our, let me move this, our email address. So please do email us with anything. Other than that, please fill in this survey. And thank you again for joining today.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Bye, guys.
All the best with it. Thanks, Sarah,
All the
for
best.
coordinating. All the best.